The previous segment, Part 6, ended with General Marshall's Confederate Army trying to survive a terrible winter and spring of 1861-62 in southwest Virginia after having been driven out of Kentucky in January by General Garfield's Union forces. With Marshall's Virginians in Lebanon and Russell County, the 5th Kentucky Infantry had been moved to Holston Springs in Scott County near the Tennessee border. By the end of March 1862, bad weather, inadequate clothing and rations, death from disease, but perhaps mostly having to put Kentucky behind them for a second time since the 5th had formed 6 months earlier, caused some of the men to begin agitating, requiring that they be separated from the rest. Willis Green Gevedon, the brother-in-law of William Likens Barker, who married Willis's sister Luann, fell sick while at Holston Springs, just as the weather finally broke, at least temporarily. On April 2nd, Edward Garrett wrote, "Spring day, sweet day, sunny day, how we can appreciate such days." Ominously, on April 6th, news began to trickle in of a great battle near Corinth, Mississippi. Josie Underwood wrote in her diary from Bowling Green, Kentucky, quote, "We are horribly uneasy. There were rumors today of a big battle. If there was, all of those we love on both sides must have been in it. God have mercy and stop this cruel war, I pray." Unquote. Josie's fears were justified. The largest battle of the Civil War to date by far had occurred by the Tennessee River at what the Union called Pittsburgh Landing. But in the history books, it would be remembered for the tiny church on the battleground called Shiloh. The two-day battle, involving over 70,000 men, produced a staggering 23,000 casualties. The battle was in favor of the Confederates the first day, but Grant's army was reinforced by Buell's, and together they turned the tide the next day. After standing on the battlefield under a flag of truce to collect the dead, Grant later wrote, quote, "I saw an open field so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across in any direction, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground." Unquote. Although it was considered a victory by the Union, the toll on both sides forever dashed any hopes that this would be a short war. Reality set in at Shiloh. Josie's next entry reflects the unique and painful divisions in Kentucky caught between two cultures. Quote, "The feeling between the rebel and Union people gets bitterer and bitterer as the war goes on. Lizzie Wright sits on her porch across the street and I on ours, and merely the coldest bows and never a visit now." Unquote. On April 8th, the 5th Kentucky had been given orders to break camp at Holston Springs and join the rest of Marshall's army at Lebanon. Willis Gevedon was left in the hospital there, whatever that consisted of. His older brother, William Leach Gevedon, remained as well because he was, according to his muster card, quote, "waiting on sick in hospital," unquote, and may have been the impetus for becoming a physician after the war. A week later, Colonel Williams, who commanded the 5th Kentucky, was promoted to brigadier general and took overall command of all the regiments at Lebanon, about 2,000 men. Jack May was promoted to full colonel and took charge of the entire 5th Kentucky. Marshall sent out recruiters to bring in 300 more men, but only got 100, not enough to replace the deserters and the sick. Meanwhile, the Conscription Act was passed by the Confederate Congress, making every current and new soldier remain for a 3-year term. The news caused great unrest in the 5th Kentucky Infantry since they had signed up for only 1 year of duty, but Marshall assured them that it had no effect on them since Kentucky was not officially a Confederate state. Even after 2 weeks, Garrett couldn't accept the defeat at Shiloh, nor comprehend the magnitude of the slaughter. On April 23rd, he wrote, after reading a copy of the Cincinnati Daily Press, quote, "It gave two descriptions of the terrible battle of Shiloh, or what they call Pittsburgh Landing, vainly endeavoring to cover up the terrible defeat they suffered and telling all manner of lies, such as the rout of Beauregard's army, its pursuit to Corinth, etc., ad infinitum. The whole paper is filled with calls and notices for nurses, physicians, comforts, etc., 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 for the thousands of wounded in Tennessee." Unquote. The same day, Marshall had the 5th Kentucky on the move again, sending them south from Lebanon to Abingdon, Virginia, perhaps to ease the strain on local resources once again. The following week, news arrived of the fall of New Orleans to Admiral Farragut, leaving the lower Mississippi open for Union troops and supplies. Garrett was more resigned to this news, writing, quote, "This is a great blow to the Confederacy, but our cause is just, and in God is our trust," unquote. As a side note, it is curious that with as amazing a memory as George Washington Noble had, neither he nor Edward Garrett ever mentioned one of the most remarkable members of the 5th Kentucky Regiment, Martin Van Buren Bates, the giant of Letcher County. He was 7 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 470 pounds. He joined the 5th in November 1861 at Whitesburg and was with the Barkers and Gevedons as well as Noble at the Battle of Middle Creek. Union soldiers told tales of a Confederate giant who's as big as 5 men and fights like 50. By all accounts, Bates was not the stereotypical gentle giant and could be ruthless on the battlefield. Later in the war, after re-enlisting, he reportedly used 2 specially made colossal 71 caliber horse pistols worn strapped across his chest, wielded a saber 18 inches longer than standard, and rode a Percheron draft horse. Bates would survive the war and, astonishingly, marry a woman 3 inches taller than he. On May 3rd, news arrived that a large army with 6 Union regiments under General Jacob Cox was moving south up the New River Valley east of Princeton, West Virginia, to take control of a vital rail line that ran south of it and alarmingly just north of Saltville. The mine there produced high-quality salt for the curing of meat for much of the Confederate Army. Marshall immediately ordered the 5th Kentucky, Moore's 29th Virginia, and a cavalry battalion to an advanced position at Liberty in Tazewell County, and Trigg's 54th Virginia to Saltville. Garrett wrote, quote, "The 5th Kentucky passed through Lebanon early this morning, looking finely and in fine spirits, had 9 drums. Colonel Moore's regiment passed through about 4 p.m., quite warlike," unquote. The largest collision yet with the Union Army was stirring for the men of the 5th. Would they be routed once more like they had been at Ivy Mountain and Middle Creek, or would their fortunes finally change? Look for part 8 in this video series.